Being right feels good. For these 6 people, it felt good for about 5 seconds. Then, it felt like nothing at all, forever. This is a documentation of their final victory and their final breath. These actions must never be repeated. The air inside the Dayton metal fabrication plant was a thick cocktail of smells. It was the sharp scent of cutting fluid, the odor of hot steel, and the faint electric tang of ozone. It was 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, the time of day when the factory's rhythm felt most hypnotic. At the center of this industrial orchestra was the Cincinnati Model 250H, a hydraulic press the size of a delivery truck. Its dark green paint was scarred and faded from decades of shaping steel. To Frank Miller, a 58-year-old operator with hands like hardened roots, this machine was not just a tool, it was a partner he understood intimately. Standing beside him was Leo Schmidt, 23 years old, his safety goggles still shiny and new. Leo's mind was filled with the clear, unambiguous rules from the company's safety manual. A core principle of that manual was the lockout-tagout procedure. It was a sacred multi-step ritual to render the machine completely powerless before any human hand entered its working area. You had to kill the main power. You had to bleed every ounce of pressure from the hydraulic lines. Then you had to physically lock the controls. The process was non-negotiable. The trouble started with a tiny jagged piece of scrap metal, a slug, which had become wedged in the machine's die set. This small defect interrupted the press's cycle, triggering a soft but persistent alarm. Leo, acting on instinct and training, immediately moved toward the main power disconnect panel and stated that it was time to start the lockout. His voice was steady. It was the voice of the manual. Frank let out a short, tired laugh, dismissing the procedure as a 20-minute ordeal. He insisted that he could pop the slug out in less than 30 seconds. The dispute was more than a disagreement. It was a battle of philosophies. Frank's hard-won experience against Leo's modern, systematic training. Frank argued that the large red emergency stop button was all the safety they needed. To prove his point, he slammed his open palm onto it. The deep drone of the hydraulic pump motor instantly died. The sudden silence was jarring. Frank then theatrically waved his hand through the light curtain, an invisible infrared beam designed to halt the machine if broken. As he predicted, nothing happened. With a look of smug satisfaction, Frank declared that the machine was dead, completely asleep. This was the bifurcation point, the moment a simple choice sealed his fate. He was betting 3 decades of routine against a fundamental law of hydraulics. Leo tried one more time, his voice now pleading, as he warned Frank that the accumulator was still charged and needed to be bled. He attempted to simplify the concept, explaining that it was like a giant pressurized tank. While the pump was off, it still held thousands of pounds of force, just waiting for a signal. But Frank was already moving, his pride deafening him to the warning. He grabbed a long metal hook and leaned into the massive steel maw of the press, focusing entirely on the trapped piece of scrap. His body was twisted at an awkward angle to get the right leverage. In that moment of intense focus, his hip pressed against a small recessed lever on the machine's control housing. It was a manual override, a control intended only for specialized maintenance to inch the ram down slowly. It was a direct line to the stored energy in the accumulator. There was a faint but sharp click. The sound was almost lost in the background noise of the factory. For a split second, there was nothing. Then came a violent, deep hiss. It was the sound of highly pressurized fluid being released from its prison. The 10-ton ram did not fall. It was driven. It moved with the full engineered speed and power it was designed for. There was no time to pull back, no time to even register the colossal error in judgment. The action was brutally efficient. The immense force delivered by the hydraulic system resulted in immediate and fatal compressive injuries to the upper torso and cranial region. The press completed its cycle with a deafening final clang. It was the sound of a mission accomplished. A small green light on the control panel flickered on, signaling that the cycle was complete. The jammed metal slug, now free, fell and skittered across the concrete floor. For a long moment, the only sound was the indifferent hum of the factory continuing its work. Then, Leo Schmidt's scream finally came, a raw, human sound of horror in a world of unfeeling machines. The rain was not just falling, it was a solid wall of water, trying to force the Ford Explorer off the road. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle, their frantic rhythm a heartbeat of anxiety in the dark. It was just after 11:09 p.m. on a rural Ohio highway. The world outside the car had dissolved into a roaring black chaos. Inside, the only anchor to reality was the calm blue glow of the GPS on the dashboard, its synthesized voice a beacon of logic in the storm. At the wheel, Mark was tense, his entire being focused on keeping the tires on the invisible asphalt. But the real storm was in the passenger seat. His father-in-law, Robert, radiated a hostile silence. For Robert, the glowing screen was a personal insult. It represented a world that no longer valued his experience, his memory, his gut. The argument started as a low murmur an hour ago and had been escalating ever since. The GPS was the reliable system, the norm, a network of satellites offering a path of calculated safety. Robert's memory was the dangerous variable, a map drawn by pride. The critical moment arrived when the GPS issued a clear, simple command. In a half mile, keep left to stay on Route 322. Robert scoffed, dismissing the GPS's instruction as the tourist route. He insisted that there was a cut-through just ahead, Old River Road, which would shave 30 minutes off their travel time. Mark, keeping his eyes on the road, countered with his concerns. He reminded Robert that it was pouring, that the GPS didn't show the road, and that it could be washed out. Robert's response was not about navigation, it was about dominance. He disparaged the technology as a toy that would drive them into a lake, arguing that a real man relies on his own eyes and experience. The argument was no longer about the fastest route, it was a challenge. It was Robert telling Mark he wasn't capable. The headlights picked out the intersection. To the left, the painted white lines of the highway gleamed in the rain, a promise of safety. To the right was a dark, menacing hole in the trees. It wasn't a road, it was a dare. The GPS repeated its advice to keep left, but Robert, his voice a low growl, commanded him to turn right, immediately. In that split second, Mark was no longer a driver. He was a man cornered by an unwinnable argument. Continuing on the highway would mean another hour of Robert's condescending silence. Turning would end the fight. It was an act of surrender. He wrenched the wheel to the right. The vehicle lurched off the smooth asphalt and onto a trail of mud and gravel. The sound of the tires changed to a sick, grinding protest. The GPS screen went blank for a second, then lit up with a single damning word: rerouting. The dirt road was a nightmare. Deep water-filled ruts pulled the SUV side to side, and low-hanging branches scraped at the windows like claws. Mark gripped the wheel, a cold dread seeping into his stomach. He had made a terrible mistake. After a mile that felt like an eternity, the trees suddenly fell away. Ahead, the road seemed to level out, crossing a dark patch of what looked like a small bridge. It was a deadly optical illusion created by the rain and darkness. The old wooden bridge wasn't just damaged, it was gone, torn away by the flooded river hours before. There were no signs, no barriers, just an abrupt, gaping void. The headlights swept over the edge and found only black, churning water. For a brief, impossible moment, the vehicle was no longer a car, but an aircraft without wings. The forward momentum became downward velocity. The impact was absolute. The vehicle's front end crumpled, and the sudden violent stop caused catastrophic internal injuries to the occupants in the front seats. The structural integrity of the cabin was instantly compromised. allowing the cold black river water to flood the interior with overwhelming force, resulting in death by drowning for those in the back. The SUV's electrical system shorted out, plunging the scene into total darkness. But in the submerged cockpit, a single piece of technology, shielded by its own battery, flickered back to life one last time. The GPS screen glowed with an eerie green light. In the silent, watery tomb, it offered its final, useless piece of advice. When possible, make a legal U-turn. The garage was David's kingdom. The smell of gasoline and sawdust was his air, and the clutter of tools on his workbench was his organized chaos. On this Saturday morning, his new two-post car lift stood in the center of the floor like a monument. Its bright red paint gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a promise of countless projects to come. David saw himself as a man of action, a problem solver who didn't need a piece of paper to tell him how the world worked. His wife, Sarah, stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel of caution. In her hands, she held the lift's installation manual, a document David had tossed aside. It represented the norm, a set of rules engineered for safety, based on physics, not feelings. She pointed to a detailed diagram on page 12. The instructions were crystal clear. The lift's massive steel posts had to be secured to the 4-inch thick concrete floor with special expansion anchor bolts. These were not ordinary bolts. They were designed to bite into the concrete from within, creating a bond so strong it was almost unbreakable. The latent variable was a heavy coffee can on David's workbench. It was filled with thick, 3/4-inch bolts left over from a deck-building project. To David, they looked strong enough for anything. The argument began with a simple question. With a gentle but firm voice, Sarah asked if he was using the bolts that came with the lift. Without looking up, David replied that he was not, asserting that his bolts were stronger. Grade 8 steel, which he considered overkill. Sarah took a step into the garage, holding the manual out like a shield. She insisted that the manual was very specific on this point, stating that anchor bolts were required. She added that it was full of warnings and explicitly said that regular bolts could pull out. He stopped and finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and pity. He dismissed her concerns, claiming that lawyers write manuals for the dumbest person in the world. He argued that a bolt was a bolt and that the situation was a matter of basic physics, with the weight pressing straight down. The argument was no longer about hardware. It was a challenge to his authority in the one place he was king. Her words implied he was the dumb person the manual was written for. He tightened the last of the deck bolts with a deafening rattle from his impact wrench, a sound that served as a full stop to their conversation. He then declared that the lift was secure and wasn't going anywhere. The critical moment, the point of no return, had been reached. To prove his absolute certainty, he decided on a final dramatic demonstration. He drove his heavy Chevy sedan into the garage, carefully aligning it between the two red posts. With a defiant look at Sarah, he pushed the up button on the hydraulic pump. With a low, powerful hum, the lift arms engaged the car's frame, and the 2-ton vehicle began its ascent. For a brief, tense moment, everything was fine. The car hung, suspended 6 feet in the air, perfectly still. He had won. He gave Sarah a smug grin, grabbed his tools, and rolled under the massive machine on his creeper. The task was simple: replacing an exhaust sensor. He positioned his impact wrench, took a breath, and pulled the trigger. The garage exploded with a series of violent, staccato bursts. What he didn't understand was that he had introduced a new, deadly force into his flawed equation: vibration. The thousands of tiny shock waves from the wrench were traveling through the car's frame, down the steel posts, and directly into the 4 bolts that were supposed to be his foundation. But they were not anchored inside the concrete. They were just sitting in holes. The intense vibrations were causing them to loosen their grip, turning and walking themselves out with every burst of the tool. The first warning was a sharp metallic sound. It was the sound of one bolt head snapping under the sheer force. The entire 2-ton load shifted, transferring to the remaining 3 bolts. A deep groan came from the post as it tilted a fraction of an inch. Then came a loud, sickening crack as a second bolt was ripped out of its hole. The shift in weight was now catastrophic. The remaining supports failed in an instant. The entire assembly, the lift, and the car collapsed in a single, violent motion. The devastating force of the impact caused immediate and fatal compressive trauma to the head and torso. The crash was a deafening roar of twisting steel and shattering concrete that shook the entire house. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, a thick cloud of concrete dust hung in the air. One of the car's wheels, now free of any load, spun lazily in the wreckage, its motion a final, useless echo of the forces that had been unleashed. On the workbench, the open manual lay undisturbed, its pages showing the simple, correct way to do a job that had just ended a life. The bar was a loud, sweaty box of raw emotion. It smelled of spilled beer, greasy appetizers, and the collective anxiety of 50 people staring at glowing screens. Every television was a portal to the same battlefield, the final 2 minutes of the championship game. The score was tied. This was the annual ritual for Kevin and Mike. For more than a decade, they had occupied this same corner booth, transforming from best friends into sworn enemies for 3 hours every fall. The established norm was a comfortable chaos of loud cheering and even louder insults. A verbal sparring match fueled by cheap beer and a deep brotherly bond. It was their tradition, but tonight the atmosphere was different. The immense pressure of a championship game combined with a steady flow of alcohol since noon was a dangerous latent variable. The usual playful jabs had curdled into something meaner. The jokes were landing like punches, each one aimed at a real or imagined weakness. They were no longer just watching a game. They were waging a personal war. The trigger was the final desperate play. A 50-yard field goal attempt as the last second ticked off the clock. The kick was good. The ball sailed through the uprights, a perfect arc of victory. The game was over. The bar exploded. Half the room erupted in a primal roar of triumph. The other half slumped in a collective groan of despair. Kevin, whose team had just won, shot out of his seat as if electrocuted, his arms raised to the ceiling, a scream of pure joy tearing from his throat. Mike sat motionless, staring at the screen, his face a pale, slack mask of disbelief. Kevin, completely lost in his victory, jumped down and got directly in Mike's face, spraying spittle as he yelled, taunting Mike that he had been right all along and that his team were choke artists who got what they deserved. The argument that followed was no longer about football. It was a raw, drunken inventory of personal failures and perceived slights, with the game's outcome as the excuse. The verbal brawl spilled out of their booth and across the crowded floor toward the exit. Kevin, still gloating, led the way, with Mike right behind him, his voice rising in anger. They reached the bar's entrance, a small landing that led to a short, steep flight of 3 worn concrete steps down to the dark sidewalk. This was the bifurcation point, the edge of the cliff. Needing to land the final blow, Mike spat out a vicious, unforgivable insult. It was a cruel joke targeting Kevin's family. A line so far over the boundary of their friendship, it was in another territory. A switch flipped in Kevin's brain. The ecstatic joy of his team's victory was instantly vaporized, replaced by a pure, white-hot surge of rage. He spun around and shoved Mike hard in the center of the chest with both hands. It was not a calculated attack. It was an impulsive, animalistic burst of fury, a physical command to stop the unbearable words he had just heard. The shove was more powerful than he intended. Mike's eyes went wide, not with pain, but with the sudden and dizzying realization that he was no longer on solid ground. His heel had slipped off the edge of the top step. His balance was gone, instantly and completely. He pitched backward into the night air, his arms windmilling uselessly. The fall was brutally short. The unforgiving city sidewalk waited below, an unmoving slab of concrete. The descent ended with a sickening wet thud that was audible even over the noise from the bar. It was the sound of a human skull making violent contact with an immovable object. The impact caused immediate and catastrophic blunt force trauma to the cranium. His body crumpled at the bottom of the steps, a broken shape in the dim light from the street lamp. From inside the bar, a fresh wave of triumphant cheering erupted as the winning team's celebration was replayed on the screens. The happy noise washed over the sudden, horrific silence on the sidewalk. Kevin stood frozen at the top of the steps, the rage draining out of him like blood, replaced by a cold, spreading wave of horror. He stared down at the unmoving form of his best friend. A cell phone lay on the concrete nearby. Its screen lit up. It was displaying a notification from a sports app, a bright, cheerful banner announcing the final score of the game that had just cost a man his life. 4 hours. The Monopoly game had been running for 4 grueling hours. The living room, once filled with laughter, now felt like a cage. The air was stale, the pizza was cold, and the friendly competition had decayed into a quiet, grinding war of attrition. The game board was a wreck of mortgaged properties and scattered fake money. It was a perfect picture of a failing economy. For Michael, every roll of the dice was another nail in his coffin. He was being systematically dismantled. His properties were gone. His cash was almost zero. Across from him, his best friend Ben was the king. Ben's side of the board was a fortress of greenhouses and red hotels. He wasn't just winning, he was dominant. The norm of their lifelong friendship was being stressed to the breaking point by the artificial rules of the game. The dangerous variable was Michael's ego. He couldn't stand losing, especially not like this in a slow, humiliating bleed-out. The final, fatal move was a roll of the dice, a 7. Michael's small silver top hat game piece skidded to a stop on Boardwalk. It was the most expensive property on the board, and Ben owned it. A single red hotel sat on it like a monument to Michael's failure. Ben leaned back, a pitiless smile on his face. With fake sympathy that only made it worse, he called the situation brutal and stated that the rent on Boardwalk with a hotel was $2,000. Michael had maybe $200 left. It was over. A wire snapped inside his head. He wasn't just a loser in the game, he felt like a loser in life. His voice quiet and tight, he accused Ben of cheating, claiming he had put the hotel there without buying 4 houses first, which was against the rules. Ben just laughed, asking what Michael was talking about. He insisted he had bought the houses an hour ago and dismissed Michael as just a sore loser for being wiped out. The argument was no longer about the game. It was about pride. It was about Michael refusing to accept his defeat. The words got louder. The accusations got uglier. Finally, Michael's frustration boiled over. He shot to his feet with a yell, shouting that it was a stupid game anyway, as he swept his arm across the table. The board flipped into the air. A storm of paper money, plastic hotels, and metal tokens rained down across the living room floor. Ben jumped up, his own anger finally ignited, yelling back that it was just a game and demanding to know what was wrong with Michael. They were now inches apart. 2 friends turned into primal competitors. The air crackled. This was the point of no return. Blinded by a wave of pure rage, Michael shoved Ben hard in the chest with both hands. It was a short, explosive burst of frustration. It was not meant to cause harm, only to create space. But the shove was harder than he intended. For a long, slow-motion second, Ben was airborne. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with surprise. His heel caught on the edge of the thick area rug, and his balance was gone. He flailed his arms, trying to find something to grab onto, but there was only empty air. The living room fireplace, a cozy brick structure that had warmed them all winter, was now an immovable object in his path. His uncontrolled fall ended abruptly. There was a sickening, dull thud as the back of his head connected with the sharp, unforgiving corner of the brick hearth. The impact with the solid masonry caused an instantaneous and fatal blunt force trauma to the cranium. He collapsed to the floor in a heap and did not move. The sudden, absolute silence in the room was deafening. Michael stared, his mind unable to process what had just happened. The fire of his anger was gone, replaced by an icy wave of horror. He had not won the argument. He had destroyed everything. On the floor nearby, half hidden under a colorful $20 Monopoly bill, lay the tiny silver top hat. It was a stupid piece of metal from a stupid game, and it was now the last artifact from a life that had just been tragically and pointlessly lost. The Chicago wind was a living entity, an invisible predator that hunted the streets. It slammed against buildings and screamed down alleys, carrying a payload of fine, stinging ice. The city was under siege by the weather, a state of shared misery that turned every block into an isolated island. On this oppressive gray afternoon, the only sound on the snow-choked residential street was the relentless rhythmic scrape of Stanley Nowak's shovel. For 2 solid hours, he had waged a solitary war against a foot of concrete-heavy snow. Stanley was 55, and every muscle from his shoulders to his calves burned with a dull, acidic fire. But he had won. Before him was a perfect black rectangle of clear asphalt, a sanctuary he had carved out of the chaos. This act was more than simple labor in Chicago. It was a ritual. It was the foundation of an unwritten law known as dibs. You pour your sweat onto the frozen ground to clear a space, and that space becomes yours. It was a fragile truce with the brutal winner, a social contract held together by mutual respect for effort. He leaned on his shovel, his breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. He was exhausted but satisfied. He just needed 5 minutes to go inside, to let the feeling return to his frozen fingers before moving his car. The warmth of his house was a shock to his system. As he poured a cup of coffee, the bitter, dark liquid a promise of reward, he glanced out his living room window, and he saw it. A blue sedan, instantly recognizable as his neighbor Gary's car, was nosing its way into his pristine, hard-won space. The latent variable had arrived, threatening to shatter the unspoken law. For a long second, Stanley didn't move. He simply watched, a cold disbelief turning into a hot, volcanic rage. He saw Gary cut the engine, get out, and stretch, as if he had just completed some great task. Stanley threw his front door open so hard it banged against the wall and stormed out onto the porch, the freezing air a useless balm on his fury. His voice raw, he yelled, demanding to know what in the hell Gary thought he was doing. Gary turned, a lazy, unconcerned smirk on his face, and replied that what he was doing was called parking. He reminded Stanley that it was a public street and that he didn't own it. The argument was ignited. It was a classic, pointless confrontation fueled by pride. It was Stanley's 2 hours of grueling labor versus Gary's casual, entitled convenience. The yelling escalated quickly. Stanley shouted about the work, the sweat, and the respect. Gary shot back with taunts, accusing him of being an old man trying to own the street. Neighbors began to watch from the safety of their windows as the 2 men drew a line in the snow. The argument had burned itself out, leaving only the raw physical need to win. This was the point of no return. With a final, guttural roar of pure indignation, Stanley lunged forward and shoved Gary in the center of his chest with both hands. It was an impulsive, explosive gesture, not a calculated attack. It was a physical exclamation point to his rage. But Stanley's fury had made him forget about the environment's most dangerous weapon. Gary stumbled backward, his arms windmilling. His boots, offering no traction, slid out from under him on a treacherous, almost invisible sheet of black ice. For a brief, terrifying moment, he was suspended between control and chaos. His face was a mask of shock as he realized He was no longer in charge of his own body. He was just an object in motion, his trajectory dictated by physics. The city curb, a simple, low granite border he had stepped over 1,000 times, was now an immovable executioner's block. His uncontrolled fall ended with a sickening wet thud as the back of his head connected squarely with the sharp 90-degree edge. The impact with the solid frozen stone caused an immediate and fatal injury to the brainstem. Gary collapsed onto the snow-dusted pavement, a final, still form. The world went utterly silent. The only sound was the indifferent howl of the wind. Stanley stood frozen, the fire in his veins extinguished, replaced by a spreading glacial horror. He stared at the still body, then at his own hands, his mind refusing to connect the two. Gary's blue car sat perfectly parked in the cleared space, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. And on the ground beside the driveway, the snow shovel lay where he had dropped it. It was just a tool of wood and steel, now a permanent marker for the exact spot where a stupid argument over nothing had ended everything. We've examined 6 fatal arguments, but the world is full of them. What is the absolute stupidest, most trivial thing you have ever seen 2 people physically fight over in real life? A spilled drink, a TV channel, a dirty look. Share the most pathetic reason for violence you've ever witnessed. The more trivial, the better. We are cataloging human folly. Subscribe.